I'll never forget the night the deal was struck, the night that changed everything. The papers were signed, the ink barely dry, and in one motion my grandfather handed away the life he had built for nearly 7 decades. $4 million. That was the price of Carter Ranch acres of rolling Montana pasture, where the sky felt endless and the horses seemed to breathe the land itself. He didn't keep a penny for himself. He slid every dollar across the table to my father, Richard Carter. The only thing he asked in return was spoken in a voice worn thin by years of hard labor. "Just take care of me, son." His eyes were tired, but they still carried the quiet strength of a man who had broken colts at dawn and mended fences in blizzards. My father nodded, smiling the kind of smile that photographs well but hides too much. I wanted to believe him. My mother Margaret certainly did. She always believed him. My name is David Carter. I was 25 at the time, working as a mechanic at a garage off Main Street in Billings, taking night shifts, delivering parts just to keep afloat. I wasn't rich. I wasn't powerful. But I carried with me something my grandfather had planted deep long before money ever entered the picture: loyalty. As I stood in that room watching my father accept $4 million with a firm handshake and a rehearsed grin, I felt something coil tight in my chest. It should have been a moment of security, a moment where we all breathed easier, knowing Grandpa would never have to worry again. But instead it felt like a shadow had slipped in through the window. Grandpa Henry was a cowboy in the truest sense. Even in his late 70s, his boots carried the dust of 100 rides, his hands calloused from ropes and reins. He wasn't just family to me. He was a compass. He taught me how to saddle a horse, how to tell when a storm was rolling in just by the color of the sky. He was the one who knelt beside me when I split my knuckles fixing a gate, telling me pain's just proof you're still fighting. And yet, as he sat across from my father that evening, shoulders a little stooped, fingers trembling as he set down the pen, I saw something I had never seen before, in him: vulnerability. My father, Richard, was the opposite. He had left the ranch long before chasing boardrooms and real estate deals, always talking about bigger opportunities and modern futures. To him, the ranch had been a burden, a cage of mud and sweat he couldn't wait to escape. When Grandpa signed it away, my father didn't see heritage or sacrifice. He saw leverage. He saw doors opening into country clubs and investors' offices. I wanted to think maybe money would soften him, make him grateful. But the way he looked at that check, it wasn't gratitude. It was hunger. The irony was brutal. One man gave up everything in trust. Another accepted everything with a promise that cost nothing. And there I stood between them, the grandson, the mechanic, with oil on his hands, silently praying that my father's smile meant what it should. Yet deep down, I already knew it was only the beginning of a test none of us were ready for. At first, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed. After all, a new house should have meant new beginnings. My father wasted no time in buying a sprawling suburban home outside Billings, with polished hardwood floors and a garage big enough for 2 gleaming SUVs. He drove up in a Cadillac Escalade, the kind of car that made neighbors nod in approval. My mother Margaret smiled politely at the country club dinners he suddenly insisted on attending while I watched him shake hands with men in suits who barely remembered his name. Outwardly, it looked like success. Inwardly, something was unraveling. Grandpa Henry was given a guest room at the far end of the hallway. At first, it sounded thoughtful, his own space, Dad called it, but it didn't take long before I realized what it really was: distance. The farther Grandpa was from the family's main life, the easier it was to forget him. I'd stop by and find him sitting in an old recliner, the television buzzing low, his cowboy boots neatly lined by the bed, like relics of a life that didn't fit in this polished house. Dad's attention shifted completely to his new circle bankers developers, men who laughed too loudly at their own stories. He started speaking a new language, one built from stock tips and property deals. When Grandpa asked for help carrying laundry down the stairs, Dad sighed as if he'd been interrupted from curing cancer. When he spilled a glass of water at dinner, my father's jaw tightened, his words sharp. "For God's sake, can't you even hold a cup anymore?" I saw Grandpa's eyes drop to his hands, those same hands that once roped wild horses now trembling. I wanted to say something, but my throat tightened every time. I kept telling myself Dad was just under stress, that he would come around. I held on to that lie longer than I should have. My sister Susan saw it too. She'd linger outside Grandpa's door, bringing him tea or folding his laundry when no one asked her to. She'd whisper to me late at night, "David, it's not right. Dad's treating him like a burden." But when I urged her to speak up, she shook her head. "You know how he gets. He'll turn on me if I push too hard." And she wasn't wrong. Richard Carter had a temper sharpened by pride. Confronting him felt like walking into a storm without shelter. So Susan stayed quiet, and I did too, though my silence ate at me. Every time I heard my father laugh at a country club while Grandpa ate soup alone in the kitchen, I felt something inside me split further apart. Looking back now, I realize those cracks were not sudden. They were hairline fractures spreading slowly through the foundation of our family. And just like a house built on shifting ground, we were heading toward a collapse that no one wanted to see, except me, standing in the middle, watching it all crumble piece by piece. The cracks that had spread quietly through our family finally split wide open on a night I will never erase from my memory. Winter had settled hard over Montana, the kind of winter that gnawed through the walls and rattled the windows until every breath turned to frost. Snow piled against the porch, and the wind howled like some wild animal circling our house. It was on that night the truth finally bared its teeth. I woke to voices rising from downstairs, sharp, jagged words slicing through the dark. My father's voice thundered, first bitter and impatient. "You're dragging this family backward. Dad, I can't keep babysitting you while I'm trying to move us forward." Grandpa's reply was steady but frayed like a rope on the verge of snapping. "I gave you everything I had, Richard. All I asked for was a roof and a little kindness. Is that too much for a son?" Silence hung for a beat. Then the slam of a fist on the table rattled the air. "Yes, it is too much," my father shouted. "You made your choice when you signed it over. Don't think you get to chain me down now." By the time I reached the stairs, the argument had spilled into the back hallway. My father stood with his face carved from stone, one hand on the doorknob. My grandfather, my proud, weathered cowboy of a grandfather, stood shivering in his old flannel shirt, trying to pull his coat around him. Then, with a single motion, my father yanked the door open and shoved him into the blizzard. The wind roared inside, filling the kitchen with icy breath. Grandpa's staggered boots sliding on the snow-slick porch, his breath puffing out in white clouds. For a moment I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. My own father holding the door like a jailer, his eyes flat and cold. My grandfather's lips were already turning blue, his shoulders hunched against the storm. That image seared itself into me, hotter than fire, colder than ice. Behind me, Susan had crept out of her room, her face, pale eyes wide. She clutched the railing, whispering, "David, please don't." Fear had her by the throat. She knew defiance only brought Dad's rage. Her silence, her stillness, it was the same silence that had kept us trapped for years. But something broke in me that night. I couldn't stand by anymore. I pulled on my jacket, stormed past my father, and stepped out into the biting wind. Grandpa's body shook against mine as I wrapped my arm around him. "You're coming with me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He tried to protest, his words faint against the storm. "I don't want to be a burden, David." I looked into his weary eyes, the same eyes that had once taught me how to ride, how to work, how to be a man. "You're not a burden," I told him. "You're my family, and I'll take care of you." Behind the glass, I saw my father's shadow, unmoving. Susan's figure hovered in the hall, her face streaked with silent tears. That was the night I chose my grandfather over my father. That was the night love demanded I turn my back on blood. The night I led Grandpa away from that house felt like walking out of one life and stumbling into another. My beat-up Ford coughed against the cold as we drove through the snow into Billings. The heater barely pushed out warmth, and Grandpa sat beside me, bundled in his old coat, silent except for a weak cough now and then. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but I knew I couldn't leave him behind. My apartment above the hardware store wasn't much, 2 cramped rooms, creaky floors, and a heater that rattled like it was giving its last breath. But it was ours. I gave Grandpa my bed and stretched out on the couch that sagged in the middle. He protested, whispering that I should keep the bed, that I needed rest more than he did. I shook my head. "You raised me to be a man," I told him. "This is what a man does." The weeks that followed tested every part of me. I worked mornings at the garage, wiping oil off my hands just long enough to clock in for evening deliveries at the supermarket. I hauled boxes, pumped gas, stocked shelves, anything to make rent and keep food on the table. Groceries were simple beans, rice bread, sometimes chicken if the tips were good. But Grandpa never complained. He'd smile when I set the bowls down, call it a feast, and thank me as if I'd brought him steak and potatoes. As his body weakened, his voice carried more weight. He told me stories about the ranch, about riding out before dawn with frost on the saddle, about storms that came fast enough to take a man's life if he wasn't paying attention. He spoke of honor, of keeping your word even when it cost you. One night, he said softly, "Money makes men reveal who they are. Don't ever forget David character is worth more than any ranch or fortune." Those words cut deep because I had seen exactly what he meant. Not everyone understood what I was doing. Some of the guys at the garage would joke, call me crazy for giving up nights out, for working myself half to death to take care of an old man. "You're wasting your best years babysitting," one of them laughed, sipping a beer after shift. Their words stung. But when I went home and saw Grandpa waiting by the window humming an old cowboy tune, I knew I wasn't wasting anything. I was gaining something no money could buy. During those hard months, Pastor John from the little church on Main Street stopped by often. He'd bring a hot meal sometimes, just sit and listen while Grandpa told his stories. More than once he pulled me aside and said, "You're doing the right thing, son. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." His words steadied me when exhaustion pressed in. Life was grueling, yes, but in the quiet moments, the laughter over a simple meal, the warmth of shared memories, the sound of Grandpa's steady breathing in the next room, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before. We had so little, and yet somehow it was enough. Spring crept in quietly, melting the last of the snowdrifts that had lined the streets of Billings. After months of bitter cold, the mornings carried a softness, the kind that makes you believe new beginnings might be possible. But for me, that season would forever be marked by an ending. One morning, I noticed something was off. The apartment was too still. Usually I'd hear the shuffle of Grandpa's slippers on the floor, or the faint hum of his cowboy tunes drifting from the bedroom. That day, there was nothing. My heart sank as I pushed open the door. He lay there, hands folded across his chest, his face calm in a way that made the silence unbearable. His chest didn't rise. His body felt cool when I touched his hand. I sank to my knees beside the bed, tears burning my eyes. I whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa." For everything, it was the only prayer I could manage. The man who had been my anchor, my teacher, my friend, gone as quietly as he had lived. The funeral was small, held at the little church Pastor John tended. A handful of old ranch hands came, their backs bent with years, but their voices thick with emotion as they shared memories of wild horses, summer storms, and Henry Carter's unshakable grit. One neighbor, a retired cowboy himself, choked up as he said Henry was the kind of man you measured yourself against. If you came even close, you were doing all right. I sat in the front row, gripping the edges of the pew, listening as story after story painted the man I had always known, a man of honor, of quiet strength, of deep kindness. It brought me comfort, but it also deepened the ache of loss. And then there was my father. Richard sat stiffly near the front, checking his watch, as if time itself annoyed him. His eyes scanned the room with impatience, like he was attending a business meeting that had run too long. There was no grief in his posture, no sorrow etched across his face. If anything, there was calculation, as though he were already planning what came next. Susan sat beside me, her shoulders trembling. She kept her eyes fixed on the casket, her lips pressed tight until they finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and in a choked whisper she said, "I should have spoken up. I should have done something." Her guilt poured out in sobs, and I wrapped an arm around her, holding her as she shook. I knew her silence had haunted her, just as mine had once haunted me. I looked back at my father, his expression as unmoved as stone, and felt a fire stir in me. Grandpa's death deserved reverence, not impatience. His life had been a legacy, not a burden. That day, standing over the casket, I promised myself that whatever came next, I would honor the man Richard had cast aside. Little did I know the real reckoning was waiting just around the corner inside a lawyer's office, where a sealed envelope would shatter everything my father thought he controlled. After the funeral, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I believed grief would be the final weight I had to carry. But grief wasn't the end, it was only the threshold. A week later, I found myself walking into the polished oak office of Mr. Green, my grandfather's longtime lawyer. The blinds were half drawn, letting stripes of pale sunlight cut across the heavy desk, where an envelope waited like a sealed verdict. My father was already there, leaning back in his chair, a smug grin tugging at his mouth. He looked like a man confident in victory, as though the fortune was already deposited in his account. My mother Margaret sat beside him, her hands knotted in her lap, eyes darting between us. Susan sat next to me, pale and silent, her grief still raw. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickles against your skin before a storm breaks. Mr. Green cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the envelope. His voice was calm, steady, almost ceremonial. Henry Carter leaves the proceeds of the Carter Ranch totaling $4 million to his son, Richard Carter. My father's smirk deepened. He shot me a glance, a silent, "See, it was always mine." But Mr. Green wasn't finished. His tone shifted as he continued. "With one condition. If at the time of Henry Carter's death, he was not under the care of his son, but instead in the care of another, the estate shall be transferred entirely to that person." The words landed like thunder in the room. My father's smile faltered. My mother gasped softly, her hand rising to her mouth. Susan gripped the edge of her chair. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, unsure if I had even heard correctly. Mr. Green went on, methodical and firm. He cited medical records, witness accounts, and testimony. Pastor John confirming Grandpa had lived with me in his final month's neighbors, verifying my nightly routine of bringing groceries and medicine up the stairs, even hospital files listing my apartment as Grandpa's residence. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of my father's entitlement. Finally, Mr. Green closed the folder and looked at me. By the terms of Henry Carter's will, the estate transfers in full to his grandson David Carter. The silence that followed was unbearable and electric. My father shot up from his chair, his face crimson, his voice shaking with rage. "This is ridiculous. He gave the money to me. That was his decision." Mr. Green's reply was quiet, but immovable. It was also his decision to set conditions, Richard. He wrote in his own hand, "A fortune is wasted in selfish hands. Let it go to the one who shows me love when I have nothing left." My mother's eyes filled with tears. She turned to my father, her voice breaking. "He trusted you, Richard. He gave you everything and you betrayed him." Susan sat frozen pale as paper, her silence louder than any scream. And me, I sat still, my hands trembling, my mind spinning. I had never cared about the money. But in that moment I realized Grandpa had seen me, had trusted me in a way my father never could. What should have felt like victory instead felt like judgment, and the weight of it was crushing. My father's rage filled the lawyer's office like a storm crashing through glass. He slammed his fist against the polished oak table so hard the pens rattled. "I'll take this to court," he roared. "You can't strip me of what's rightfully mine. I'll fight this until the day I die." His voice shook not from fear, but from the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by the very man he thought he'd broken. Mr. Green, calm as ever, folded his hands and leaned back in his chair. "Richard, you can fight if you wish." But Henry anticipated this. "His instructions are airtight, his witnesses clear. The will cannot be overturned." His voice had the weight of finality, the sound of a door closing on my father's desperate grasp. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother gentle quiet. Margaret rise against him. Her voice trembled, but not from weakness. "You betrayed him, Richard. He gave you everything. His trust, his money, his name, and you threw it away for your pride." My father turned toward her, his face a mask of disbelief, as if her words cut deeper than the lawyer's verdict. For decades, she had stood by him, smoothing over his anger, hiding his sharp edges from the world. But not today. Today, she saw him plainly, and she let him see her disappointment. Susan sat beside me, tears streaking her cheeks. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold, trembling. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. I saw what he was doing to Grandpa, and I stayed silent. I was afraid. I let fear keep me quiet when Grandpa needed me most." She squeezed my hand, her eyes begging. "Can you forgive me?" I looked at her, and though my heart ached, I nodded. I knew the weight of silence. I had carried it myself far too long. Her guilt didn't need my condemnation, it needed release. My father's fury turned on me next, his eyes cold and burning bored into mine. "You think you earned this? You didn't. He used you. He twisted you against me." His words spat like venom, but I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than any defense I could give. I met his glare with silence, my heart steady for the first time in years. That silence was heavier than any words I could have thrown back. It told him what I could not, that Grandpa's choice was his own. And it was final. The room was suffocating in its quiet after that. My father's chest heaved with anger. My mother wept softly into her hands. Susan clung to me with trembling shoulders, and Mr. Green closed the file with a snap that echoed like a gavel. When we finally walked out into the fading afternoon light, I felt the air hit my face like a release. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer whispered behind closed doors. It stood in the open, undeniable. And though it cost my family everything, it gave my grandfather the justice he deserved. Walking out of Mr. Green's office, papers in hand, I felt no triumph. $4 million was supposed to feel like a windfall, but to me it felt heavy, like carrying the echo of my grandfather's voice everywhere I went. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't planned for it. And yet somehow I knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't buy a mansion or trade in my old Ford. I didn't fill closets with suits or take vacations to beaches I'd only seen in magazines. Instead, I drove out to the edge of Montana, where the land stretched wide and the air still smelled of horses and dust. A piece of the Carter Ranch had been sold off to strangers, but I bought back what I could, just enough to feel Grandpa's spirit in the soil. The old barn was falling in on itself, the roof sagging boards rotted from years of neglect. I rebuilt it beam by beam the way Grandpa would have wanted, sturdy, honest, without shortcuts. When it stood tall again, I placed a plaque at the entrance with his name carved into it. Henry Carter, a man of honor. Not for me, not for show, but so that anyone who stepped foot there would know who had built this life with his bare hands. But honoring him meant more than wood and land. It meant people. I remembered how Grandpa always said the future belonged to the young, and how too many farm kids never got the chance to chase more than the next season's harvest. So I started the Henry Carter Scholarship, a fund for kids from ranching families who wanted to study agriculture, veterinary medicine, or whatever dream called them beyond the horizon. Every award letter carried Grandpa's name, and every time a kid held that paper, I wanted them to feel what I had felt. Belief passed down like a gift. My mother came often, her steps slow but steadier than I'd seen in years. She sat on the porch sipping coffee as the sun went down, her eyes soft with peace. Susan, too, her guilt never fully left, but she found comfort helping with the scholarship, writing letters to the students, keeping Grandpa's name alive in every story told. My father never came. He stayed in town, isolated, his once prized social circle thinning like smoke in the wind. People whispered about what he had done, how he had lost not only his father's fortune, but his father's respect. Pride had built his walls, and pride kept him trapped inside them. As for me, I found myself back on the porch of the rebuilt barn one evening, the sky painted in shades of gold and fire, the same Montana horizon I had stared at as a boy stretched endless before me. In the quiet, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice, calm and steady. A man isn't remembered for his money, David. He's remembered for how he treated his family. And in that moment, I understood. The true inheritance wasn't the $4 million. It was the love, the lessons, the legacy of a man who never let pride outweigh kindness. That was what I carried forward. That was what I would pass on when my own time came. This story may have touched you in ways words can't fully capture. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part resonated most with you? And let me know where in the world you're watching from down in the comments. Your voices make this community stronger. Don't forget to subscribe to Domestic Tragedy for more stories that reveal the truths families often hide.